Another story awaits, but first, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. It started with a question no parent ever expects to face. Not shouted, not dramatic, just a quiet, unsettling realization that something about their own child didn't feel right. By the time police began connecting the dots, they would uncover a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, one that raised disturbing questions about responsibility, denial, and how far a mother might go to protect her son. This is the case of Arcan Cetin. Before his name appeared in headlines, before investigators examined his past, he was just another young man living under his mother's roof. To neighbors and casual observers, nothing seemed unusual. There were no obvious warning signs on the surface. But behind closed doors, there were tensions, behaviors, and moments that would later take on a much darker meaning. Police would eventually learn that the answers they were looking for didn't just exist in evidence files or witness statements. Some of those answers were hidden much closer to home, inside a family dynamic shaped by fear, loyalty, and silence. The story begins long before the crime itself. It begins with patterns. Arcan Cetin had a troubled background that was known to some, but not fully understood by many. He struggled with anger, instability, and isolation. Those closest to him noticed it first. His mother, especially, saw changes in his behavior over time. Mood swings, outbursts, withdrawn periods followed by intense reactions. These weren't sudden shifts, they built slowly. According to later reports, concerns about his mental state were not new. There had been moments when people around him felt uneasy, moments when something seemed off, but no one quite knew how serious it could become. And when discomfort is mixed with family loyalty, it often gets buried instead of confronted. His mother stood at the center of that conflict. Like many parents, she believed she understood her child better than anyone else. She believed she could manage the situation, that whatever was wrong could be handled privately, without outside interference. But belief does not stop escalation. As investigators would later piece together, there were signs that Arcan's behavior had crossed from troubling into dangerous territory. Concerns that could have triggered intervention were either minimized or ignored, and that silence would later become a key part of the case. When the crime finally occurred, it shocked the community. The brutality and suddenness of it forced everyone to ask the same question: how did it get this far? Law enforcement moved quickly, but as they dug deeper, they realized this was not just a case about one act of violence. It was about what came before it and what was hidden. As police began their investigation, they followed standard procedure. They examined timelines, they spoke to witnesses, they reviewed digital records, but something didn't sit right. The story they were being told didn't fully match the evidence they were seeing. There were gaps, inconsistencies, pieces that felt carefully left out. That's when attention turned to the family. Investigators began asking difficult questions, not accusations, questions. What did the mother know? When did she know it? And why hadn't certain information been shared earlier? At first, her cooperation appeared normal. She spoke calmly, she answered questions carefully, but the more detectives compared her statements to documented facts, the clearer it became that important details were missing, not forgotten, withheld. This is where the case took a disturbing turn. Police would later determine that Arcan's mother was aware of key warning signs long before the crime occurred. She had seen behavior that suggested her son posed a serious risk, not just to himself, but to others. Yet instead of reporting these concerns or seeking sustained help, she chose to keep them private. The reasons behind that choice are complex: fear, denial, shame, the instinct to protect, but none of those erase consequences. For investigators, this wasn't about blaming a parent for a child's actions. It was about understanding how silence can become dangerous, how the decision to hide the truth, even with good intentions, can enable something far worse. As police reconstructed the timeline, they found moments where intervention could have happened, moments where information could have changed outcomes. Each one raised the same painful question: if the truth had been shared earlier, could lives have been saved? This wasn't just an investigation into a crime, it became an investigation into missed chances. Public reaction was intense once details emerged. Many struggled to understand how a mother could carry such knowledge and not act. Others saw a more complicated picture, one shaped by fear, emotional exhaustion, and the crushing weight of responsibility. But law enforcement had to focus on facts, not sympathy. What they discovered would eventually show that this case wasn't just about a killer. It was about a truth that was hidden, delayed, and only revealed after irreversible damage had been done. As investigators continued digging into Arcan Cetin's past, a clearer picture began to form, one that showed this tragedy did not come out of nowhere. It was built slowly through warning signs that appeared again and again, each one louder than the last. What troubled detectives most was not just that these signs existed, but that they were seen by people closest to him. Arcan's behavior had been unstable for years. Friends and acquaintances later described him as unpredictable. At times he could seem calm and distant, almost withdrawn. At other moments, his anger surfaced suddenly and without warning. These swings were not subtle, they were noticed, and they caused concern. His mother was often the first person to witness these changes. She lived with him. She saw the late nights, the isolation, the growing hostility toward the world around him. She heard the comments he made, statements that hinted at resentment, paranoia, and deep frustration. According to later findings, some of these comments were alarming enough that they should have raised immediate red flags. There were also encounters with authorities before the crime. Police records showed that Arcan had been on their radar for troubling behavior. These were not minor misunderstandings. They involved threats, aggressive actions, and moments where his mental state appeared unstable. Each time, the situation was addressed in isolation, without a full picture of the pattern forming underneath. This is where the role of the family became critical. Investigators learned that Arcan's mother was aware of these incidents. She knew about interactions with law enforcement. She knew about his struggles with anger and control. She knew that people around him felt unsafe at times. Yet when officers asked direct questions, her answers often downplayed the seriousness of what she knew. Instead of presenting a full account, she framed her son as misunderstood. Troubled, yes, but not dangerous. Someone going through a difficult phase, someone who just needed time and support. This framing mattered because it influenced how others responded to Arcan. In many cases, when authorities rely on family input, they trust that information to be honest and complete. It helps them decide whether a situation requires urgent intervention or continued monitoring. In this case, that trust became a problem. Detectives later concluded that key information was withheld, not because it didn't exist, but because it was uncomfortable. Acknowledging the full extent of Arcan's behavior would have meant admitting that he posed a real threat, and that realization is terrifying for any parent. But fear does not erase responsibility. As the timeline unfolded, investigators identified moments where action could have changed the course of events, reports that could have been expanded, conversations that could have been more direct, warnings that could have been taken further. Each missed opportunity added weight to the final outcome. Mental health experts consulted on the case explained something important. Violent acts are rarely spontaneous. They're usually preceded by a build-up of signals, verbal, emotional, and behavioral. Arcan showed many of these signals. The tragedy was not that they existed, but that they were normalized. Inside the home, his behavior became part of daily life. Outbursts were explained away, threats were minimized, silence became routine. Over time, this creates a dangerous illusion that things are under control when they are not. Police also discovered that Arcan had access to means that should have raised concern. Questions were later asked about how closely this access was monitored and whether safeguards were ignored. Again, answers were vague. Responsibility was shifted. Nothing was addressed directly. When detectives interviewed the mother again, they noticed a pattern. She spoke carefully. She chose words that softened reality. She avoided specifics. Investigators are trained to recognize this behavior, not as proof of guilt, but as a sign of discomfort with the truth. The question was no longer whether she loved her son. That was clear. The question was whether that love had crossed into protection at the cost of public safety. As details became public, the case sparked intense debate. Some people argued that she was another victim, trapped between fear of her son and fear of losing him. Others believed that once you recognize a real threat, silence becomes a choice with consequences. Law enforcement took a firm stance. While they acknowledged the emotional complexity, they emphasized one point. Knowing about danger and failing to act can allow that danger to grow. As the investigation moved closer to the crime itself, detectives focused on the final weeks leading up to it. They uncovered increasing instability, escalating anger, a sense that something was reaching a breaking point, and through it all, the same question followed them: who knew, and how much? By the end of this phase of the investigation, police were no longer just building a case against Arcan Cetin. They were examining a chain of decisions that helped shape what happened next. Decisions rooted in fear, denial, and misplaced protection. As investigators shifted their focus to the days just before the crime, the sense of inevitability grew heavier. This was the period where warning signs stopped being distant concerns and became immediate risks. The pressure was building, and those closest to Arcan Cetin could feel it. In the weeks leading up to the attack, Arcan's behavior became more unstable. People who interacted with him noticed sharp changes. He appeared more withdrawn, yet more intense. His anger seemed closer to the surface, and his patience thinner than ever. Small disagreements escalated quickly. Ordinary situations triggered strong reactions. What made this phase especially troubling was how predictable it felt in hindsight. Mental health experts later explained that escalation often follows a pattern: isolation, fixation, anger, and then loss of control. Arcan appeared to be moving through that pattern step by step. His mother was present during much of this time. She saw the tension. She heard the statements that hinted at resentment and hostility. She noticed how his behavior was no longer just troubling, but alarming, and yet the approach remained the same: manage it privately, keep it contained, hope it passes. Investigators would later learn that there were moments when outside help could have been requested, moments when clearer warnings could have been shared with authorities. Instead, those moments slipped by, replaced with reassurance and denial. Police records showed renewed concerns during this period. Interactions with law enforcement became more serious. Officers asked questions. They looked for context. They relied once again on information from the family to assess risk. And once again, the full truth did not surface. From the outside, it appeared that Arcan was being monitored. But monitoring without honesty is ineffective. It creates a false sense of control, one that disappears the moment pressure breaks. As the date of the crime approached, Arcan's mental state deteriorated further. He appeared consumed by internal conflict. Those who spoke to him later described a sense that he felt cornered, angry at the world, disconnected from consequences, and increasingly unpredictable. His mother later acknowledged that she was afraid of what her son might do, afraid of losing him, afraid of involving authorities too deeply. That fear shaped her decisions. But fear does not stop escalation. It often fuels it. When the crime occurred, it unfolded quickly and violently. The community was stunned. The randomness, the brutality, and the loss of innocent life sent shockwaves through everyone. Law enforcement responded immediately, moving to contain the situation and secure the area. Arcan Cetin was apprehended without delay. There was no confusion about who was responsible. The evidence was immediate and overwhelming, but as investigators began to process what had happened, a deeper question emerged. How did it reach this point? As detectives reviewed the timeline, they traced events backward. Each step led them to the same conclusion: this was not a sudden break. It was the result of prolonged instability combined with missed intervention. Attention returned to the family once again. Investigators re-examined earlier statements, comparing them against what was now known. Patterns emerged. Statements that once seemed incomplete now felt deliberate. Warnings that had been softened now appeared critical. The realization was painful. Important information had existed before the crime. Information that could have changed responses. Information that might have prevented the worst outcome. And that information had been kept within the family. For law enforcement, this was not about placing blame for the crime itself. Arcan Cetin was fully responsible for his actions, but the investigation revealed something else: how silence can become a factor in tragedy. As details were released, public reaction was intense. Many people struggled to understand how warning signs could be seen and not acted upon. Others empathized with the impossible position of a parent watching their child unravel. Experts weighed in, explaining how denial often becomes a coping mechanism. When reality is too frightening, people choose to believe it won't happen. That belief can feel protective, but it carries risk. In this case, that risk became real. As the investigation moved forward, police began documenting not just what happened, but what was known beforehand. This documentation would become important, not only for understanding the crime, but for preventing future ones. The case shifted from a single act of violence to a broader examination of accountability. What does it mean to know something dangerous and stay silent? Where does protection end and responsibility begin? These questions followed the case into public discussion, into training rooms, and into policy conversations. The answers were not simple, but the cost of avoiding them was now painfully clear. By the end of this stage, one truth stood out above all others. The crime was not just the result of one person's actions in one moment. It was the final outcome of a long chain of warnings, choices, and missed chances. In the aftermath of the crime, the investigation entered a new phase, one that went beyond securing evidence and identifying the shooter. That part was already clear. What police now needed to understand was how the situation had been allowed to reach this point, and who knew what before it happened. Detectives began reviewing every interaction Arcan Cetin had with authorities in the months and years leading up to the attack. Each report, each call, each note was placed in order. When seen individually, many of these moments looked manageable, but when viewed together, they formed a troubling pattern of escalation. More importantly, investigators compared these records with statements made by Arcan's mother. That comparison raised serious concerns. There were clear differences between what was documented by police and what had been shared by the family. Behaviors that officers described as threatening had been referred to as misunderstandings. Incidents that involved fear from others had been framed as emotional struggles. The tone mattered, the details mattered, and those details were missing. At this point, police were no longer asking casual follow-up questions. They were conducting formal interviews. They asked direct, specific questions about past warnings, threats, and requests for help. Each answer was carefully recorded and later checked against evidence. What emerged was a picture of selective truth. Investigators concluded that Arcan's mother had knowledge of serious warning signs, enough to justify stronger intervention, but chose not to fully disclose them. This wasn't a single lie or one moment of dishonesty. It was a pattern of omission, information that stayed inside the home instead of reaching the people who could act on it. When confronted with these findings, she did not deny loving her son. She did not deny being afraid. She admitted that she believed she could control the situation herself. That belief, investigators noted, is common in families facing similar struggles, but common does not mean safe. Police also consulted mental health professionals to better understand the dynamics at play. Experts explained that caregivers often fall into a cycle of crisis management, responding to problems as they arise without addressing the underlying danger. Over time, this creates exhaustion, denial, and avoidance. In this case, avoidance had consequences. The investigation revealed moments when stronger steps could have been taken, times when full disclosure might have led to intervention, monitoring, or protective measures. These were not guaranteed solutions, but they were opportunities, and those opportunities were lost. As these findings became public, reaction was intense and divided. Some people expressed anger, arguing that silence in the face of danger should carry consequences. Others felt sympathy for a mother trapped in an impossible situation, torn between fear for her child and fear of what might happen if she spoke up. Law enforcement acknowledged that complexity, but remained firm on one point. Public safety depends on honest communication. When warnings are softened or hidden, risk increases, not just for strangers, but for everyone involved. Prosecutors reviewed the findings carefully. While Arcan Cetin alone was responsible for the crime, the investigation raised serious ethical questions about accountability, not criminal guilt, but responsibility in preventing harm. Throughout this process, detectives were careful with language. They did not frame the mother as a villain. They framed her as a critical source of information that failed when it was needed most. That distinction mattered. Internal reviews were conducted to determine whether procedures could be improved. Could police have pushed harder? Could follow-up have been stronger? These questions were taken seriously. The case became a learning point inside departments, not just a closed file. Meanwhile, the victims and their families were left with grief that could not be undone. For them, the focus was not on systems or analysis. It was on loss, lives cut short, futures erased, and the painful realization that warning signs had existed contested. As the legal process continued, the role of the mother remained under scrutiny, not as the cause of the crime, but as a factor in how the danger was managed. Her silence became a symbol of a larger issue: what happens when fear overrides responsibility. By this stage, the story had evolved. It was no longer only about Arcan Cetin and the violence he committed. It was about the spaces between action and inaction, about how difficult truths are sometimes hidden to preserve normalcy, and how that choice can have devastating results. The investigation made one thing clear: violence rarely appears without warning. The warnings are often quiet, uncomfortable, and easy to dismiss. But ignoring them does not make them disappear. As the legal process moved forward, the focus widened beyond the crime itself. The courtroom was no longer just a place to determine guilt, because Arcan Cetin's responsibility was already clear. Instead, it became a space where deeper questions were examined, questions about prevention, about silence, and about where personal loyalty ends and public responsibility begins. During court proceedings, prosecutors laid out a detailed timeline of Arcan's behavior leading up to the attack. They highlighted prior warning signs, police encounters, and documented concerns. Each point reinforced the same conclusion: this was not an unforeseeable act. The danger had been building. Expert witnesses were called to explain how violent behavior often escalates when early signs are ignored. They spoke about patterns of isolation, fixation, and emotional instability. They explained how family members, especially parents, are often the first to notice these changes, and how their response, or lack of response, can influence outcomes. The mother's role was discussed carefully. The court did not treat her as a criminal, but it did examine her decisions. Prosecutors emphasized that she had information that could have changed how authorities assessed the risk. That information, they argued, was not shared fully or clearly. Defense arguments focused on the emotional reality of parenting a troubled adult child. They described fear, exhaustion, and the instinct to protect. They argued that she believed she was helping by keeping matters private, by trying to manage her son's behavior herself. But the court made an important distinction: intent does not erase impact. Judges and legal experts stressed that while her actions may not have been malicious, the result of withholding critical information contributed to a failure of prevention. This was not about punishment. It was about accountability and learning. Outside the courtroom, public discussion intensified. Media coverage highlighted the uncomfortable truth that family silence can have real consequences. Many viewers found themselves asking difficult questions. What would I have done? Would I have spoken up? Would I have recognized the danger in time? Mental health professionals weighed in, pointing out that families often lack proper support when dealing with unstable behavior. They argued that the system places too much responsibility on individuals without providing clear paths for help. This case exposed those gaps. Law enforcement agencies responded by reviewing their own procedures. Some departments introduced new training focused on recognizing patterns of escalation and encouraging deeper follow-up when family members minimize risk. Others emphasized the importance of documenting concerns thoroughly, even when information feels incomplete. For the victims' families, these discussions brought little comfort. Their loss was permanent, but many of them spoke publicly, urging people to take warning signs seriously. They emphasized that speaking up, even when it's painful, can save lives. The case of Arcan Cetin began appearing in academic studies and professional training sessions. It was cited as an example of how violence is rarely sudden and how prevention depends on honesty, communication, and courage. Through it all, one theme kept returning: silence is powerful, but not in the way people expect. It does not protect, it delays, and sometimes delay is all violence needs. By the time sentencing concluded, the legal chapter of the case was nearing its end. Arcan Cetin would spend the rest of his life defined by his actions. But the impact of the case extended far beyond one individual. It forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about families, about fear, about how close danger can be without being acknowledged. And it left behind a question that continues to echo: when someone sees the warning signs clearly, what is their responsibility to act? As the courtroom doors closed and the legal process reached its conclusion, the case did not simply fade into history. Instead, it settled into public memory as a warning, quiet, heavy, and difficult to ignore. The story of Arcan Cetin was no longer just about a violent act. It had become a lesson about what happens when danger is seen, understood, and still left unspoken. In the months after sentencing, investigators, mental health professionals, and law enforcement agencies revisited every stage of the case. They examined how information moved, or failed to move, between people. Reports showed that no single mistake caused the tragedy. Rather, it was a chain of missed chances, small decisions, delays, assumptions that someone else would step in. The role of the mother continued to be discussed, not with anger, but with unease. Many experts emphasized that she was not the villain of the story, yet her silence played a critical role. They explained that families are often trapped between fear and denial, fear of losing their child, fear of legal consequences, fear of admitting that someone they love may be capable of violence. But this case made one thing clear: protecting someone from consequences can sometimes expose others to irreversible harm. Public safety forums and training programs began using this case as an example of why early intervention matters. Officers were encouraged to dig deeper when family members appeared hesitant or evasive. Mental health workers stressed the importance of creating safe spaces where families could speak honestly without feeling immediately blamed or punished. Victims' families, meanwhile, continued to live with a reality that could not be undone. Their statements focused less on anger and more on prevention. They urged people to speak up, even when it feels like betrayal, even when it hurts, even when the truth feels unbearable. Their message was simple but powerful. Silence does not keep the peace, it only postpones the damage. The broader public began to understand something this case revealed with painful clarity: that violence often announces itself long before it happens, in changes in behavior, in words that sound alarming, in fears shared behind closed doors. The tragedy is not always that no one knew. Often, it's that someone did know and hoped it would pass. Today, the case of Arcan Cetin stands as a reminder that responsibility does not always come with malicious intent. Sometimes it comes from hesitation, from love mixed with fear, from choosing quiet when action is needed. This story forces us to confront a hard truth. Caring for someone does not mean shielding them from reality. True responsibility sometimes means speaking up, even when it feels impossible, because once the warning signs are clear, the choice to remain silent is no longer neutral. And when silence wins, the cost can be lives that never had a chance to be saved. This was not just a story about a killer and his crimes. It was a story about what happens before the crime, when the outcome is still uncertain, and the power to prevent tragedy is still within reach. J.